So, good evening and welcome to our Thursday evening online class and to the third of our 12 short studies on the book of the Prophet Ezekiel. Following last week's terrifying class, we'll be moving into the main body of the text as we continue to work our way through this rather long book and get to grips with an understanding of the message of the book of the prophet Ezekiel. We're doing that using this as our outline, and so here in week 3 we've entitled this session Jerusalem Will Be Destroyed. And so tonight we're going to be looking at the beginning of the work. We'll take a look at the model city. We'll see the prophet lying on his side, eating his rationed meal. Then we've a little episode entitled The Sword and the Haircut, before making it abundantly clear that this is Jerusalem. So before we begin with the work, let's remind ourselves of the outline we have already committed to our memories. And here it is. You will recall the 5-point outline, which I suggested would be very helpful if we would remember this for the rest of our lives, I suppose. We'll start off with the first point, the vision and the commission. It's in chapters 1 to 3. And then the main section of the book, really, from chapters 4 to 24, where the prophet makes it clear that Jerusalem will fall. Then the next section in chapters 25 to 32, we're told that the foreign nations will fall, and then the news will reach the ears of those in captivity in Babylon that Jerusalem has fallen. But we will end the book on a high with this last section of the book from chapters 35 to 48, in which the prophet will make it clear that Jerusalem will rise. Good times are to come. So that's where we were last week, and this is where we're going to be this week at the beginning of this section, which we've entitled Jerusalem Will Fall. Now, it has been a week since Ezekiel the priest looked and saw a stormy wind coming out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and from the midst of the fire coming the likeness of 4 living creatures. Indeed, a week has passed since Ezekiel the prophet was told to go to the house of Israel to speak to them the words of the Lord which he would give to him. But now that time has come. And so chapter 4 begins, and this main body of the book begins by God speaking to the prophet, "And you, son of man, take a brick and lay it before you and engrave on it a city, even Jerusalem, and put siege works against it, and build a siege wall against it, and cast up a mound against it. Set camps also against it, and plant battering rams against it all around. And you take an iron griddle and place it as an iron wall between you and the city, and set your face toward it, and let it be in a state of siege, and press the siege against it. This is a sign for the house of Israel." So firstly, the prophet is told to take a brick and lay it before them and engrave on it a city, even Jerusalem. Now, this may have been a clay brick, perhaps similar to this one illustrated here. This is a clay brick with an inscription on it. It's inscribed with the name and titles of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So it dates from the era of the prophet Ezekiel. This one, along with many like it, can be found on display in the British Museum. So it may well have been a clay brick like this, or then again it may have been something a little smaller, like a clay tablet. Here's a picture of a Babylonian clay tablet. You could hold this. It was about the size of your hand. And this one here happens to depict a Babylonian map of the world, again dating from around about the time of the prophet Ezekiel. The NIV renders this as a block of clay, presumably still soft, so that it could be inscribed. And possibly as it sat out in the sun, as we'll see, for many days, may very well have baked solid with whatever it was that the prophet inscribed upon it. And whatever he drew, it must have been recognizable to those who saw as being the city of Jerusalem. You could imagine perhaps if you were inscribing upon a clay brick, a clay tile or tablet or what have you, a picture of your city. There might be a number of notable buildings that you would draw and what have you to make it recognizable. There is some discussion as to whether the events following are to be seen as some sort of war modelling in which the prophet was to create some sort of battle scenario, either with clay or in the sand or some other props, or whether he was simply going to be drawing this upon the brick or the tile. Keel and Davidson suggests the latter, that everything he's about to describe he simply inscribes on the tile. More recent works generally suggest the former, that the prophet is about to embark upon a protracted wargaming demonstration, which was likely intended perhaps to draw the crowds in ways that mere words wouldn't do, and that's what I'm pretty sure the prophet is about to do. And so we're about to embark upon a reenactment. Well, not perhaps maybe a reenactment, because the events which the prophet is about to portray have not yet actually happened, but they're going to. For sure, they're going to happen. Now, if we were in a classroom, we would reenact the demonstration first of all. I would get down on the floor, and we would do a full performance of all that Ezekiel's about to do, but we're not, so we won't. Instead, we'll do this. Here is our tile or our brick or our tablet, with the drawing upon it, the inscription of Jerusalem and the city around about. We'll need then to bring in some siege walls. Now, there's a bit of ambiguity here. These might very well have been either siege towers, such as these represented here, which may or may not have had wheels to enable them to move, or it may be that Ezekiel is describing siege trenches, both of which were employed in warfare, siege warfare of this era. He's then told to build some siege ramps. There are to be some camps, military camps, housing the soldiers, presumably, and then he is to portray battering rams that would be coming up against the walls of the city, and then he takes this iron griddle. So this is the setup something along these lines. He's then to take this iron griddle, which presumably he's borrowed from Mrs. Ezekiel in her kitchen, and he's to take this iron griddle and he's somehow to lay siege. I picture him perhaps pushing all of these things, moving them up somehow like this until we end up with some muddled conglomeration. So there's the reenactment for you on your screens here. So very vividly displayed for us, this siege of the city of Jerusalem. So let's have a look at some of the details of what's involved here. And we need to be rather brief because we've got an awful lot to cover here this evening. The prophet is told to take a brick or a tile and draw upon it the city of Jerusalem. And then he's to enact a siege against the city using siege walls or towers or trenches, and as we've suggested, these may very well have been siege towers, might have been trenches, but here's a picture of an Assyrian siege tower, so somewhat earlier, a couple of hundred years plus before the time of the prophet Ezekiel, but nothing much had changed in the interim period. This is some detail from a wall panel from the palace of Ashurnazirpal II. He was really the king who made Assyria into the, or at least began to make Assyria into the great empire that it was to become. And this panel here dates from about the 9th century BC, and you can see here the siege tower, which may or may not have been on wheels. Some were, some weren't. And notice also, whilst we're in this picture, the battering ram there at the front, and these would have been on wheels. And this design developed somewhat over the years, but the same principle. There was this large ram that battered the walls, as you can see taking place in this this picture before us. It might be useful to read from the end of the book of 2 Kings chapter 25, the account of the events which the prophet is predicting, foretelling in this demonstration that he's giving to those with him in captivity. We're told that in the 9th year of his reign, that is the 9th year of the reign of Zedekiah, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came with all his army against Jerusalem and laid siege to it, and they built siege works all around it. Well, that's exactly what the prophet is demonstrating here before his fellow countrymen in captivity. So that which the prophet is now demonstrating with this dramatic performance before his own people prior to these events was going to come to pass, just as he is predicting some 6 years or so down the line. Now, the prophet mentions also siege ramps, at least that's how they're spoken of in the NIV, the NET. The ESV speaks of casting up a mound against it. But this is a very typical form of siege works. And if we may just take a very slight digression here at this point, for reasons that will become most evident in a moment. Here is a picture I took a number of years ago of the gateway at the city of, or the remains of the city of Lachish. This is Tel Lachish. Now, this is where once stood Judah's second most important city, second only to the capital city of Jerusalem. And you can see there on the left-hand side of the picture this typical staggered Iron Age gateway. Now, in 1935, during an archaeological dig, in the midst of a burned layer, what we speak of a burned layer within archaeological strata, it would be a layer that was noticeably darker than those above and beneath it, and would signify generally a period of destruction when the city had been burnt and destroyed by enemies. And this layer corresponds with the 586 BC. You've remembered that date, haven't you? One of those three dates that you committed to memory a little earlier. This burnt layer is associated with this 586 BC destruction by the Babylonians. And within this layer, within a room in the main gatehouse, were discovered a number of ostraca, that is potsherds, bits of broken pottery, which looked, of course, rather like this here. This is two of them. There was quite a collection of them, and they're now found. They're now housed in various locations, some of which are indeed on display in the British Museum. And if you've never been to the British Museum, then you jolly well ought to go. And if I'm free, I'll more than happily take you around, and we'll look at some of the biblical related exhibits. So these potsherds here, these ostraca, the writing was written in black ink in a Paleo-Hebrew script, and they were sent at the time of the 586 BC Babylonian invasion. They were sent from the outposts of Lachish to the city commander, leading up to the destruction. Now, Jeremiah says this in chapter 34 of his book, that when the army of the king of Babylon, that's Nebuchadnezzar, of course, when the army of the king of Babylon was fighting against Jerusalem and against all the cities of Judah that were left, Lachish and Azekah, the only fortified cities of Judah that remained. So Jerusalem hasn't yet been destroyed. Lachish and Azekah are still standing. They're relatively close to each other. And so one of these letters, not actually the one illustrated, but for illustrative purposes this may work. One of the letters reads in part, "May Yahweh cause my Lord to hear news of peace. Even now, you can sense a desperation in the writing of the one who is in this outpost of Lachish, writing to the commander, desperately hoping that there will be some kind of peace made with the Babylonians, that the city won't be destroyed. Longing for peace, longing that everything was going to work out okay." And then another one of them reads, having mentioned the beacons of Lachish and Azekah, the two cities mentioned by Jeremiah, having mentioned them, he writes, "But we do not see Azekah, for that city had fallen." The beacon had been extinguished, the city had fallen, and they would have known that they, the inhabitants of Lachish, were very much next on Nebuchadnezzar's hit list. Well, not far away from the... I just thought it was interesting looking at that, written actually during the time of the Babylonian invasion, just half a dozen years or less after Ezekiel had enacted his prophetic siege of the city of Jerusalem, which was the next to fall after Lachish. Well, not far from the gateway at Lachish are the remains of the only known siege ramp from the Iron Age era. There it is to the right of the picture, built by the Assyrians, possibly later used by the Babylonians. So when Ezekiel speaks of the construction of siege ramps built against the walls of the city of Jerusalem, this is what he's thinking of, this kind of thing. And well, let's return to the text, shall we? And after having spoken of the siege wall, casting up a mound against it, these siege ramps, he speaks of setting, God tells him to set camps also against it, plant the battering rams, and we saw one just a little while ago from a slightly earlier era on that wall panel of King Ashurnazirpal II, who incidentally must never be confused with King Ashurbanipal, two completely different individuals. And then he was to take this iron griddle, placing it between him and the city, and then pressing the siege against it. Well, whilst all of this is going on, undoubtedly some crowd is going to be gathered. They're going to be looking on at this priest, as they would have known him, performing this enactment of a siege. And well, what are they going to be thinking? They're going to be thinking, I don't know, is he potty? Is he a traitor? I mean, after all, this is not any old city. This is Jerusalem, and they would have surely recognized that on his drawing. I mean, just think for a moment. What if you were to be in a foreign land with your fellow countrymen, and you were to do the same with a model of your home city, wherever that might be? If you were to make a model, to draw a picture of your home city with your fellow countrymen gathered around about, and then you enact a siege against it, I mean, they're not going to be, too well pleased with you, are they? And how are you going to feel about all of this? I mean, pretty awkward, to say the very least, yeah? How might Ezekiel, be feeling about this? Well, this, he was told, and presumably told his fellow countrymen, this is a sign for the house of Israel. It was a performance that was to grab the attention of his fellow countrymen, whilst at the same time dramatically foretelling the downfall of their beloved city. But for many watching, there was also something of a superstition which suggested that acting out a prediction was more likely to make it happen. And this would have enraged and angered many who were watching. Well, one thing was for sure. Jerusalem was to be destroyed. And here he is, with his siege model in front of him, lying on his side. For he was told, beginning in chapter 4, from verse 4, the Lord said, "Then lie on your left side and place the punishment of the house of Israel upon it." For the number of the days that you lie on it, you shall bear their punishment. For I assign to you a number of days, 390 days, equal to the number of the years of their punishment. So long shall you bear the punishment of the house of Israel. And when you have completed these, you shall lie down a second time, but on your right side, and bear the punishment of the house of Judah. 40 days I assign you, a day for each year. And you shall set your face toward the siege of Jerusalem with your arm bared, and you shall prophesy against the city. And behold, I will place cords upon you, so that you cannot turn from one side to the other, till you have completed the days of your siege. This is perhaps a little tricky. Not terribly so, but it's a little tricky. So let's begin by looking at the main features of this part of the demonstration. The prophet is told to lie on his left side for 330 days. And he's to do this for Israel, bearing the punishment of Israel. We'll say maybe a little about that in a moment. Then he's to lie on his right side for 40 days for Judah. We're told that these days are equal to the number of the years, a day for a year. And there's only one other time in Scripture where this principle applies, this day representing a year. And that is all the way back in the book of Numbers in chapter 14. You remember the context immediately as you see these words, I'm sure, that according to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear your iniquity 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. So as a result of those the 10 faithless spies who brought back an unfavorable report, having been sent into the land God had promised his people, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, they came back and brought this unfavorable report. And so, according to the number of days in which they had been spying out the land, these 40 days, they would spend the next 40 years wandering in the wilderness, as we say. And so the prophet was told that he shall set his face towards the siege of Jerusalem, this model that he had created there before his fellow captives. You shall set your face toward the siege of Jerusalem with your arm bared, and you shall prophesy against the city. So you picture him there, facing the siege model, bare-armed, prophesying against it, as he's lying upon his side for what turns out to be a rather lengthy period of time. Well, we need to ask ourselves, what is the significance of this part of the demonstration? Well, needless to say, there are lots of theories, though most of them look for some sort of a chronological solution and seem to imply that one would have had to have some sort of, one would have to have been some sort of historical wizard and mathematical contortionist to have worked out exactly what it was that was being said. But I don't think that God would have intended to make what is surely a very plain truth so obscure. We try to work out what is meant by these 390 days, or each one representing a year, or the 40 days representing another 40 years. It would have been enough to have kept a tally on the number of days during which he was lying on each side, without having to devise some sort of chronological solution, without even knowing where to begin the 390 years, or the 40, or where to end them. Presumably the lengthy duration of this demonstration would have aroused considerable curiosity, even though it might to some have soon grown rather old. But once he turned from his left side over to his right, and then when he stopped this performance altogether, the significance of the number of days might then have become apparent. Of course, there are still lots of questions that we might ask. Are these two periods, the 390 days and then the 40 days, are they to run concurrently or consecutively? Well, I think consecutively. Because in chapter 4 and verse 6, he's told that when you have completed these, that is the 390 days, you shall lie down a second time on your right side, suggesting that the 390 days would be followed by a further 40 days. There are some who try to sort of squeeze the 40 days into the final 40 days of the 390, but I don't think that's what's happening. I think they are to be consecutive. But either way, for over a year, the prophet is to reenact this siege scenario. So we would ask, well, is he doing this 24/7? Is he doing this, constantly for this entire length of time? Well, I don't think he is, but he must have been lying around for a significant amount of time in order for it to be noticed by others. The cords that God would place upon him so that you cannot turn from one side to the other there in verse 8 seem to suggest something of the uncompromising nature of the prophet's mission. But in light of the fact that he's also to enact another siege during this period, suggests that there must also have been periods when he was able to move about freely. So I think what's going on here is that for a significant period each day, for the entire duration of this enactment, he was to be lying on his side with his arm bared, prophesying against the city that he has already laid siege to. And then another question that I would have is, does the phrase, till you have completed the days of your siege, does it suggest that he reenacted this siege day by day, over and over, as it were? Or did he simply leave it in the state that it was after the first day and simply continue, prophesying against it over and over and over and over again? And then we must ask the question, what about the specific number of days? The 390 days, each one representing a year. The 40 days, each one of them representing a year. Well, if we added them together, the entire duration of this siege enactment, this sign, this prophetic sign that the prophet performs, comes to a total of 430 days, representing 430 years. Now, I'm not sure that the 390 days or years have any particular significance by themselves. I may be very wrong. And there are a lot of ideas that are suggested, a lot of different ideas that are suggested. But the problem is not knowing where to start or where to end. And even then, there's no obvious significance to this number 390. But if we wait until the end of the siege, the total number of days on which the prophet has been lying on his side, prophesying against the city of Jerusalem, comes to 430 now. If you were to whisper 430 years into the ear of an unsuspecting Israelite, he would immediately have thought of Egyptian captivity. For the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. I mean, it's like any of us. There may be particular dates that somebody just needs to mention, 1066 and all that. We know immediately to what they might be referring. So you say 430 years into the ear of an Israelite, and immediately he's going to think of Egyptian captivity. So 430 days representing 430 years may very well speak of the certainty of lengthy national captivity. In other words, this is not this period of captivity in Babylon is not going to be short-lived. This is going to be a lengthy affair that will involve the entire nation, and perhaps the 40 days or years may well speak of suffering, or maybe faithless disobedience, as in the 10 spies sent out by Moses. For these respective number of days, Ezekiel was to bear their punishment. Look there, verses 4, 5, and 6, and that's a little tricky. And there's lots more that we could say about this, and lots more that we could say about lots more that's going on here. But for now, let us simply say that all of this has to do with the sin and the punishment of the people. And one thing was for sure. Not only is Jerusalem going to be destroyed, but this was not going to be, for those in captivity, a short break holiday. There was no going home in a week or two, as it were. This was to be a complete national captivity, and a lengthy one at that, and it was to be a punishment for their sinful rebellion. And there's more. God goes on to say, and you take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and emmer, and put them into a single vessel, and make your bread from them. During the number of days that you lie on your side, 390 days, you shall eat it. And your food that you shall eat shall be by weight 20 shekels a day. From day to day you shall eat it, and water you shall drink by measure, the 6th part of a hin from day to day you shall drink. And you shall eat it as a barley cake, baking it in their sight on human dung. And the Lord said, thus shall the people of Israel eat their bread unclean among the nations where I will drive them. Charming, Well, the ingredients for the bread to be put into a single vessel from which each daily allowance was to be taken were fairly straightforward. There was to be the wheat and the barley, the beans, lentils, millet, emmer or spelt, and they might have looked something like that, and they were all to be put into a single vessel, which might very well have looked something like this. That's a storage jar from the same era. And the daily allowance which the prophet was to eat was 20 shekels, approximately half a pound of dry ingredients. That equals roughly 250 grams or so, and a sixth of a hin of water, approximately half a pint of water, which is roughly 300 milliliters, I think. And as for the cooking process, well, God says to him, you shall eat it as a barley cake, baking it in their sight on human dung. Human dung? Ugh! How terribly, horribly, grossly disgusting. And for the prophet, who had spent his life in preparation to serve as a priest, not only was this disgusting, it was also most unclean. And so we then read of the great concession as the prophet appeals, "Ah, Lord God, behold, I have never defiled myself. From my youth up till now I have never eaten what died of itself or was torn by beasts, nor has tainted meat come into my mouth." And then he said to me, "See, I assign to you cow's dung instead of human dung, on which you may prepare your bread." Never before in the field of human conflict, never before in the annals of history has anyone been so happy to have been offered cow's dung as is the prophet here. So not necessarily a particularly uncommon fuel, but if you are going to cook your evening meal on cow's dung, let me strongly suggest that you wait first until it has dried. So here was the prophet enacting this siege, lying on his side, prophesying against the city of Jerusalem, and on a daily basis he is preparing this bread. It's like we have here the first cookery show on the Babylonian Broadcasting Corporation, although I suspect that after a few days it would have seemed rather too repetitious, as he's eating the same thing day after day after day. Well, what does all of this rationing signify? Well, firstly, it certainly signifies that the people are to be living under siege conditions. And we know a little bit about food shortages, perhaps, following this coronavirus episode, but nothing at all, nothing compared to the likes of those experienced in times of war. Well, moreover, he said to me, "Son of man, behold, I will break the supply of bread in Jerusalem. They shall eat bread by weight and with anxiety, and they shall drink water by measure and in dismay. I will do this that they may lack bread and water, and look at one another in dismay and rot away because of their punishment." So says the Lord God. And so this sign of this rationed meal speaks of their siege conditions, and then presumably also the cooking on animal dung spoke of the unclean conditions, presumably following the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And then there follows another sign of the sword and the haircut, presumably following the 430 days of the siege enactment. And you, O son of man, take a sharp sword, use it as a barber's razor, and pass it over your head and your beard. Then take balances for weighing and divide the hair. A third part you shall burn in the fire in the midst of the city when the days of the siege are completed. And a third part you shall take and strike with the sword all around the city. And a third part you shall scatter to the wind. And I will unsheathe the sword after them. And you shall take from these a small number and bind them in the skirts of your robe. And of these again you shall take some and cast them into the midst of the fire and burn them in the fire. From there a fire will come out into all the house of Israel. Well, some more props are called for: a sharp sword and a set of scales, in order for the prophet to shave his head and his beard. And he's told that a third part will he's to burn in the fire in the middle of the city when the days of the siege are completed. That is presumably following then the 430 days. A third part you shall take and strike with the sword all around the city. And a third part you'll scatter to the wind, and I'll unsheathe the sword after them. And then you're going to take from this last third, a small number, bind them in the skirts of your robe, and of these again you shall take some and cast them into the midst of the fire, and burn them in the fire. So this performance was obviously to be only a one-night show. There was no repeating of this, having once shaved off the hair off his head and his beard. And what about the significance in all of this? Well, remember that the prophet Ezekiel had grown up ready to serve as a priest. And it was said of them that they shall not make bald patches on their heads, nor shave off the edges of their beards, nor make any cuts on their body, according to Leviticus chapter 21. What is the prophet demonstrating? He's demonstrating for sure that he is no longer to serve as a priest. And why not? Well, for the temple will be destroyed. So far, what have we seen? For we must press on here. So far, we have seen quite clearly that Jerusalem will be besieged and destroyed. This is to be a prolonged national captivity. They are to bear the punishment for their sins, for the sin of the nation. They are to suffer this prolonged national captivity, and the siege of the city will be most terrifying for those still there. The temple is to be destroyed, the priesthood to become dysfunctional. Many will die in the city. Many will die as they flee the city. A remnant will be saved, although not all of these will survive, represented there by the small number of hairs that he was to tuck into the hem of his garment. And they would see that the prophet is now, the former priest was now among them as a prophet, representing Yahweh himself. Well, we must draw all of this to a close. We've already spent longer than we maybe should have done, and he will make it clear from verse 5 of chapter 5 that this is Jerusalem. Thus says the Lord God, this is Jerusalem. I've set her in the center of the nations, with countries all around her. Well, that was not, strictly speaking, entirely geographically true. although I suppose it depends on how one looks at things. But there was certainly a trend in medieval times to draw maps of the world with Jerusalem in the center. This is a map published in Germany in 1581, in which Jerusalem can clearly be seen to be in the middle of everything. And this is one from around the beginning of the 14th century, housed in Hereford Cathedral. And you can clearly see Jerusalem there in the center of the world. Well, though it may not have been entirely geographically true, there is certainly spiritual significance, and in this sense it is true. And we might well ask ourselves, well, where did God dwell? Well, he dwelt in the Holy of Holies, in the middle of the temple, in the middle of the people of Israel, in the middle of the nations. And if Jerusalem was in the center of the nations, then so too was God. And the representative presence of God in the temple in Jerusalem, at the center of his people, in the center of the nations, demonstrated to the nations his desire to live among mankind. Well, the remainder of this section, we read that God, speaking of the city of Jerusalem, how that she has rebelled against my rules by doing wickedness more than the nations, and against my statutes more than the countries all around her, for they have rejected my rules and have not walked in my statutes. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, because you are more turbulent than the nations that are all around you, and have not walked in my statutes or obeyed my rules, and have not even acted according to the rules of the nations that are all around you. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I, even I, am against you. And I'll execute judgments in your midst in the sight of the nations, and because of all your abominations I will do with you what I have never yet done, and the likes of which I will never do again. Well, God has already made it clear what a rebellious house were his people, and now he makes it clear that their behavior was even worse than the nations among whom she lay. They hadn't even lived according to the rules of the foreign nations. And so he says, yes, I, even I, am against you. I will execute judgments in your midst in the sight of the nations. One way or another, God would show his glory through Israel. Whether through their faithfulness or not, God will always be glorified. And this is a terribly important principle. For this is not about Israel. This is not about Judah. This is not about Jerusalem. This has always been about Yahweh. And his name will always be glorified. No matter what his people do, it was never about them, whatever they might have thought. It was always about the Lord God himself. And so he says, because of all your abominations, I will do with you what I have never yet done, the like of which I will never do again. This is somewhat hyperbolic, of course, as Jesus said something very similar with regards to a later destruction of Jerusalem that would take place in AD 70. But the point is that those in Jerusalem were about to experience such horrors, the likes of which none had ever known before. And this is illustrated by the text that follows. Therefore fathers shall eat their sons in your midst, and sons shall eat their fathers. I will execute judgments on you, and on any who survive I will scatter to the winds. And on he goes. We've not time to read all of this now, but here he explains very clearly, very graphically, that which the prophet has been enacting. And he says how that my eye will not spare, I will have no pity. Thus shall my anger spend itself, and I will vent my fury upon them and satisfy myself. They shall know that I am the Lord, that I have spoken in my jealousy when I spend my fury upon them. One can almost sense, well, one can certainly sense the anger in the voice of God. And this is not going to come to an end until he has spent his fury upon them. What a terrible, terrible, terribly terrifying message this is that the prophet must bring to his fellow countrymen of those that are yet left behind in the city of Jerusalem. Moreover, he says, I will make you a desolation and an object of reproach among the nations all around you, in the sight of all who pass by. You'll be a reproach and a taunt, a warning and a horror to the nations all around you when I execute judgments on you in anger and fury and with furious rebukes. I am the Lord. I have spoken. When I send against you the deadly arrows of famine, arrows of destruction, for which I will send you, I'll bring more and more famine upon you. Break your supply of bread. I will send famine and wild beasts against you, and they will rob you of your children. Pestilence and blood shall pass through you, and I will bring the sword upon you. I am Yahweh. I have spoken. As the prophet Ezekiel was now giving a demonstration to the captives, now surrounding him there in Babylon. So God was about to give a demonstration to all the nations surrounding Jerusalem. He was to make Jerusalem an object of reproach among the nations all around, and in the sight of all who would pass by, they would be a reproach and a taunt, a warning and a horror to the nations all around them when God executed judgments on them in anger and fury and with furious rebukes. Notice these 4 judgments that he mentions there. The famine, the wild beasts, the pestilence, the sword, and we'll return to these a little later in the book. And so the prophet would speak all these words to the people, knowing that all this was yet to come to pass as the holy God of Israel continued to reveal himself through his people to the nations that surrounded their land. But now actions were going to speak far louder than words ever could. And so next week, Lord willing, stay with us. Stay tuned, same time, same place next week as we look at the unholy land of Israel. May God bless each one of us that we might truly be a blessing to those around us. Thank you.